Welcome to the Michigan Association of Secondary School Principals New and Improved podcast series featuring great discussions, insight, and resources on all things related to education and administration. Welcome back to the MASSP podcast. This is episode number 2, and we are talking to Kevin Sutton, who is from Lusk Albertson Law Firm. But before we talk to him, we're going to do a little wrap up of the AP and Dean's Summit. And I'm really excited to hear more about it. I didn't go, but I can't wait to hear the great things that happened because I heard it was amazing. So Ryan, how many administrators did you have and what kind of sessions were there?
This year, again, this took place a couple weeks ago at the beginning of February. We had about 80 to 90 assistant principals and deans of students at both the middle level and high school level from all across the state show up for a couple of days in Crystal Mountain, which isn't a bad place to hang out in the middle of winter, of course. So we were there for a couple of days, a lot of great topics, a lot of great learning took place. One of the things, obviously, we're going to have Kevin talk about with us today on the podcast are some really important legal topics that are going on right now. Another really popular part of this conference that we usually offer is on interrogation and interviewing techniques. There's a group that comes in that has some retired like state police officers and FBI officers that give tips and tricks on how to perform those to make them effective when you need to question students or witnesses, things like that, when incidents occur. Then we had just a wide variety of different hour-long sessions that all participants can kind of choose from based on what they were interested. I, for example, put on a session on technology toolbox tips for administrators, things that make them more efficient with organization and communication, stuff like that. We had College Board representatives there talking about the PSAT 8-9 and other resources, talking about other resources like Khan Academy. We had a session on multi-tiered systems of support. And then the other one, which we do at all of our MASSP conferences, was our leader-to-leader sessions, which are always really popular, which basically gets administrators to sit down at a table face-to-face in small groups and just talk about kind of a variety of different topics that are relevant or current going on right now, and it gives them a great chance to network and learn and get some names and some faces and get to know some other people that are going to be spending time at the conference with them. So there was a lot more sessions than just that, but really, really good stuff. Ran very well, like it always is, and it was a good time.
That sounds fantastic. So this happens once a year.
Yep. So we do. We've done a summit usually in the fall for principals, and then we usually offer this for the APs and deans in the wintertime. So we've been running it the last few years now. So it was again about 80 to 90 were there, and it was a good time.
What a great resource. I think one of the assistant principals that is with me in my building, he and I were talking today about how we don't really have a PLN network of APs like a lot of the principals have. So that's a fantastic way to start getting groups of people together. So thanks for doing that. And next year, I hope.
No problem.
So we have today, our guest contributor is Kevin Sutton, who is no stranger to MASSP. Just as Ryan mentioned, he was at the AP and Dean Summit earlier this year, but we're very fortunate to have him here. He's a partner at Lusk Albertson Law Firm, and he's going to kind of give us an overview on what's going on, talk a little bit about the session that he had at the AP and Dean Summit. So Kevin, thank you again for being here. And can you tell us about yourself? Tell us how long you've been practicing and how long you've been with MASSP?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast. Had the great pleasure of working with school districts now for more than 15 years. And our firm handles all aspects of school operation. I like to say everything from student discipline to collective bargaining and everything in between. In that role, have had really the great fortune of working closely with MASSP for the last 7-8 years or so. They've been really great partners. They're so dedicated to supporting their membership and providing educational resources. And they've been really gracious in allowing me to come to conferences, come to events. We do the monthly Legal Ease e-blast for their membership. And so very great pleasure for me to be able to contribute in any way I can to help bring awareness to some of these interesting and challenging topics that administrators are facing on a daily basis.
Thank you for that.
I've got to give Kevin credit too, Theresa, because I got to hear Kevin present back in the fall at the Principal Summit, and I was thinking, okay, he's going to be up on stage for 2.5 hours, which is no easy task. And number one, does a great job because it's serious topics, obviously, that you're talking about, but he keeps it light, keeps it moving. He's entertaining. He's very good at what he does. But then sitting down and listening to it, I assumed I was going to hear the same thing, and I was surprised just in about 3 short months how many things have changed already, or new things are coming down the pipeline. So it really was beneficial. Like I said, I got to hear about some of these things back in the fall, and a whole bunch of new stuff in February. So if you could, I guess, Kevin, just for everybody that's listening, I don't mind a 2.5 hour podcast because I drive to Lansing about once a week, and that's how long it takes me. But for everybody else, we're keeping these to about 20 minutes or so. So could you just kind of maybe give us maybe the top 2 or 3 different things that you would think that our listeners really need to know about right now from your presentation from the AP Dean Summit?
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you ask me, I'm not going to do another 2.5 hours right now.
Okay.
But, we call it the current legal landscape, and that obviously is a very broad title, and there's a lot of topics that need to be covered with everything that's changing in Washington, changing in Lansing, and we covered a great deal of things. But I think if I were to pick maybe a top 3 highlight in terms of what we talked about at the AP and Dean Summit, we talked a lot about service animals, and I think that's a topic that we're seeing and hearing a lot more about. There's becoming more and more requests, more and more interest in individuals wanting to bring animals into the school, many times for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons. And so some of the things we talked about, we're just really understanding what service animals are. Animals are those that do work or perform tasks, is sort of the short legal phrase on it. These are not comfort animals or therapy animals or emotional support animals that we hear a lot about. People just maybe want to have an animal with them. These are actual animals that they perform a service, and those are the types of animals that there are protections for in terms of having them in the school setting. There's a lot of confusion around sort of how many questions you can ask and things you can sort of press individuals on. So we talked a lot about that, and I know there were some surprised looks in the audience when we talked about some of the guidance that we've received from the Michigan Department of Civil Rights or the U.S. Department of Justice in terms of the limited questions that really you could ask someone who wants to bring a service animal into the school. And so we talked about that. I think sort of common sense is that you could ask a whole laundry list of questions about training and do they wear a vest and do they have a patch and all that other good stuff. Mm-hmm. And really the reality is that the guidance tells us that we can ask, is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? And that's about it. So we talked a great deal about that and ran through some scenarios. And again, I think it's type of topic that right now, if you have a request, you're going to want to certainly talk to your principal. You're probably going to want to talk to central office folks because there are some legal landmines within that area. So we spent some time about that. We even had a couple comments about miniature ponies, which is one of the categories of service animals for which there's some guidance out there. But an interesting and emerging topic that I think we're going to hear more and more about. We talked a lot about Title IX, and obviously, particularly in the state of Michigan, there's been a great deal of interest lately in the idea of Title IX with things that have been going on in East Lansing. But also, there's a lot of awareness of Title IX generally. Across the country. And so we really tried to focus on some really good reminders. We hear about Title IX all the time in the news, but what does Title IX really require of us? And when we're talking about as school administrators, we've got to have a Title IX coordinator somewhere in the district. Do we know who that is? Do we know how to communicate with them when we have concerns that arise? We talked about how Title IX is very important in terms of encouraging responsiveness and investigating concerns when they arise. And we try to think about Title IX in a broad way. So often I think we're wired to think of maybe sex discrimination or sex harassment as a male on female situation, which, statistically, there's a lot of validity in viewing it that way. But we've got to view it much more broadly. We've got to think about it as female on male, or even male on male or female on female. And the bottom line is Title IX encourages us to ensure that we have an environment that's free of sex-based harassment, no matter the parties. And so we try to talk about that really in a broad way, and trying to foster a culture of accountability, and trying to facilitate reporting. I think that's one of the things that we've seen a lot in the papers lately. We had policies in place at certain institutions, but were they really fostering a culture that encouraged reporting, that facilitated reporting, that made people feel if they had concerns, they could bring them forward? And so we talked a lot about the importance of that within the Title IX context. Also, sort of an offshoot of Title IX is this idea of LGBTQ students and how we are supporting them. It's been a bit of a roller coaster ride from a legal standpoint over the last 18 months, 2 years. But we talked about some recent court cases, including a very important decision that came out of Wisconsin. Then all of these decisions have been sort of very, very pro-student, very, very pro-student. And so we talked a little bit about what that might look like in the context moving forward in terms of trying to support these students. I think the last sort of big topic that we covered, which is a topic that seemingly just continues to grow in its importance, was social media usage, both for staff and students. And we actually started talking about staff because I think so often we think about students first in terms of how they're using social media, but we talked about the considerations for staff as well, and sort of the common maybe misconception that's out there by some staff members that they can sort of do and say what they want whenever they want if they're off duty, and that isn't exactly true. Staff members who are, at the end of the day, public employees can be subject to scrutiny and discipline depending on the nature of their speech. And then obviously we know about the student concerns, and not only trying to encourage our students to be responsible digital citizens, but making them understand that they can be held accountable for off-campus speech that's done online if it has a significant nexus to school and it creates a substantial disruption in what's going on. And so we talked about some scenarios there and some of those things. So you get just a small sampling there of some of our big topics, and you can imagine that it actually gets to be pretty easy to fill 2.5 hours. And as always, with any group of MASSP folks, great questions, great factual scenarios presented to the group to sort of digest and process. And so it was a great session with a lot of great dialogue.
Kevin, can I ask a question about the social media that you were just talking about with teachers and staff? Do you feel like this is something that's come back around? Because I feel like this is something that we talked about 8-9 years ago when social media really started getting big, that was, discussing what you can and cannot, and whether or not it's an offense that can be brought back to work. Is this something you're seeing again?
Yeah, I really think that we're seeing a tremendous rise in it, and I not to be a social commentator, but I think what we see is, everybody has it now. It's not just some kids, it's not just some faculty members, it's not just some parents. Everybody's got it. Grandma's got a Facebook page. Uncle Rico's got an Instagram, so on and so forth. And so because it has permeated every single aspect of our personal lives, I think you see people naturally sort of drawn to going on it, just like the kids are drawn to going on it. I think our staff members are drawn to going on it. And I think to a certain extent, our staff members feel pressure because they have students who want to friend them. They have students that want to follow them. Oftentimes we don't want to disappoint students. And so we sort of grapple with that. Do I follow? Do I not follow? I think we're getting educated a little bit in this idea of, only my friends will see what I post, or, I've got a limited list. I think people are developing an awareness that there's no such thing as limited posting. I mean, everybody's going to see everything, but like anything, I mean, there is the learning process, learning curve is slow sometimes. And steep, and we've got folks that I think sometimes when they're in the comfort of their home, I think they understand generally when they're at the building, what to do and not do. But this idea of when they're at home and maybe it's the evening time and they're in their PJs and they hop on a blog or they hop on Facebook and they start talking about stuff, I think sometimes they forget that really what they're putting out there to the world can be consumed by everybody. and it is reflecting on them as professionals and educators. And I think sometimes that we just lose sight of that, and not in a malicious way, but sometimes in a negligent or reckless way. And we continue to see many occurrences of staff members getting themselves in hot water for their online activities.
Thank you for, we spoke just before the podcast started, and we really would be remiss if we didn't mention this podcast is being taped 7 days after the school shooting in Florida. So from your legal standpoint, what do you see as school safety? What do you see coming down the pike? Do you feel like this might change anything or start anything?
Well, my initial response to that is going to be as a father of 2 elementary school kids, and as the husband of a wife that teaches elementary school, and I sure hope it changes something. Certainly, I think we can all agree that the frequency with which this is happening is troubling. It is troubling, and it's a source of great concern. I guess, sort of thinking about it from the legal perspective. Obviously, there's been a lot of debate in Michigan over the last handful of years in terms of the role of guns in schools. And we know we had the 2 court cases, one out of Clio, one out of Ann Arbor, and ultimately we had our Court of Appeals, weighing in and saying local school district can make decisions about whether or not they want to have weapons in their buildings. I think what we're going to see with any process, this process will be very similar in that there'll be a lot of suggestions made. I know just this evening there was a session in Washington, D.C. at the White House, a listening session, and talk about once again arming teachers, arming staff members was floated. I don't know if that's sound public policy. I don't know if that's a good idea legally, but I think we're going to see a lot of different things that are put out there. But I'm convinced that this will certainly raise the issue again in Lansing. I think they will again maybe take a look at this in terms of trying to legislate in their minds something that will hopefully increase student safety, safety for our staff members and whatnot. But it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting, and it certainly has been a topic that has been simmering for a few years now. And I know there are strong feelings both ways. I know that our folks at the Michigan State Police have thoughts about this as well, in terms of, it's one thing to say let's arm staff members. It's another thing to recognize the psychology and the mental training that goes along with that. It's not just as simple maybe as putting a gun, in the main office. And so I think there's going to be a lot of dialogue, but I think it's probably good dialogue. I think it's anytime, unfortunately, you have an outrageous and horrifying situation like this, it spurs those in policy making roles to look at what we're doing and maybe try to find ways to do it better. And so I would expect there's going to be a lot of discussion nationally and locally over the next several months about maybe what's the best way to do that.
Well, thanks for touching on that subject. Obviously, it's something that it just is on everybody's mind, as you mentioned, with parents, staff, administration, and people have obviously kids in buildings. So pretty important stuff to be talking about. We'll see what happens. If you could, Kevin, based on everything you've talked about already or other things, I guess if you can get out your Lusk Albertson crystal ball, what is the next big thing that maybe schools are going to have to address? Something, whether it's legislatively or anything else that's coming down in the next, whether it's this spring or that's going to impact us for the 18-19 school year. What's something that we maybe need to start bracing ourselves for?
Well, it's a wide range of topics, certainly that might jump up. I mean, I think we're going to continue to see evolution on this LGBTQ student rights front. I think we're going to continue to see court cases nationwide that maybe are running counter to what we've heard from Washington during the course of the Trump administration and some of the dear colleague letters and protections that OCR has rolled back under this administration. I think we're going to continue to see evolution there. I think just given its prevalence, I think we're going to continue to see social media issues, particularly with students. I know we talked a little bit about staff. but we're still using, and the courts are still using the Tinker versus Des Moines case from the 1960s, talking about black armbands in the Vietnam War when they're looking at student speech. We don't really have a modernized concept in terms of looking at student speech, and there's been a couple of cases that we thought maybe would get to the Supreme Court and haven't. So that's something that I think you've got to modernize that concept, and I think we're going to see something along those lines. I also think it's going to be very interesting to watch as we move into the 18 elections, midterm elections federally and a gubernatorial election in Michigan. There's been some very strong messages that have come out of Lansing, I think, to educators. We certainly know, everything that happened in terms of teacher tenure and whatnot. But, as we've seen just this past year, the restorative practice legislation, the seclusion and restraint legislation. And, one of the things that I talked about at the AP and Dean Summit was, what message was Lansing really sending to educators with some of that legislation? We've seen such a dramatic shift in the discretion that's been given to the school administrators in terms of discipline. We've had some interesting undertones in the seclusion and restraint legislation. And so I think as we move into an election cycle, it'll be really interesting to see what sort of messages we hear from Lansing in terms of things they think we need in the education sector, and how those things are received. So I'll be really paying a lot of attention to that as we move into the next handful of months and the candidates rev up their campaigns.
That's fantastic. So thank you again, Kevin, from Lusk Albertson, for joining us today. You can follow Lusk Albertson on Twitter at Lusk Albertson, and you can also follow Kevin at Spartan Sutton. Coming up on the MASSP podcasts, we are looking at the March principal checklist. And if you haven't been able to dig into the MASSP monthly checklists, you need to. So we'll be digging into those. We'll be talking about preparing for state assessments and a little bit of what happens around the spring break craziness. So we are looking forward to the next couple episodes. And thank you again, Kevin and Ryan, for being here today. And please be sure to subscribe and let us know any future topics that you would be interested in hearing. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Whether you are a current or aspiring principal or an educator looking for professional growth, be sure to follow along with our podcasts as well as other great resources, which can be found at mymassp.com and on social media by following at MASSP.